Yes, it does.
Amazing. All right. Let's give it another 2 minutes. Just as an intro, so today we've got the wonderful Kyle joining us, telling you all about the swab journey. I'm not going to try to explain anything about the talk because he will 100% be able to explain it a lot better than me. But yeah, if you have any questions throughout the talk, please just pop them into the chat. There will be time to answer them afterwards. We'll go through them one at a time. We'll make sure to answer any questions. Um, we will also be recording this session, so if you're uncomfortable with that for any reason, please just let me know, pop a message into the chat, message me privately, something like that. And we will make sure to either take you out of the recording or to stop recording, depending on what's most appropriate in this scenario. And if you could just mute yourself during the talk, that would be great, just so we can make sure that there's no echo or feedback going on throughout. But again, there will be time afterwards to share questions, so you can unmute yourself again afterwards to have a chat. All right, fabulous. I think we might make a start, and then anybody that joins can just join us as we go along. So Kyle, do take it away.
Sure, brilliant, thank you. So yeah, good morning, everyone. My name's Kyle. If I could just start on the next slide, please, that'd be great. Yeah, my name is Kyle. I'm the head of technical services at Anthony Nolan. So I head a team of scientists and one supervisor. There's about 8 of us in total. And I've been at Anthony Nolan for about 7 years this year. So I started straight out of uni as a scientist in one of the teams, and I've stuck around and worked my way up to be a head of one of the departments. My role is pretty varied. My team has pretty diverse duties, so I've listed some of those here. My team handle all of the clinical samples for Anthony Nolan, so blood samples, as well as DNA cell samples that come in for people who are going to donate or for patients. So we do all of the sample booking in for Anthony Nolan. All DNA extraction for these clinical samples is done through my team, ready for typing. And we also have a commercial arm in that as well to make sure that we can get some funds in from universities, etc. And my team also perform blood grouping and virology screening on some of these clinical samples where we're looking at the blood samples. So we're testing for things like hepatitis, HIV, and a virus that I'm going to speak a little about today called CMV, or cytomegalovirus. And that's the clinical side of my team's work. But we do also, which is the topic of today, cover the donor swab reception area. So that is, my team are the single team who receive these samples from online recruitment and event recruitment, ready to get them typed and onto the register. Next slide, please. So I wasn't aware of how many people would be on the call, or like how much people know. So I thought I'd give a brief introduction to some of the typing methods and also to Anthony Nolan. So a super brief history is that the charity was founded in 1974 by Shirley Nolan in response to her son, Anthony Nolan, who was diagnosed with Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome. Anthony unfortunately ended up passing away, and Shirley, in his legacy, established the register as the first one in the world for stem cell bone marrow donors. Today, Anthony Nolan supports about 3 transplants per day. We coordinate all transplants within the UK. And we also, on top of that, work to support our patients pre and post-transplant. So there's a big focus, especially increasing since I've joined the charity, for it to be a journey with the patient, not just providing the transplant, which is absolutely incredible. We also have the research arm. So that's a building next door to the laboratories that I work in. They're looking at data from previous transplants and information from around the world to coordinate and give information to clinicians and transplant centers for what is the best transplant that can be given. How do we improve on the future, for our future patients and donors? And of course, as I said, we'll be talking today about the AN register in particular, whereby someone will sign up and wait patiently for the day when they could be called to be a possible donor because they are a match with somebody. Next slide, please. So matching donors and patients is a very significant part of the stem cell transplant journey. Here, what we're looking at is typing individuals for a set of genes called the human leukocyte antigen genes, often referred to as HLA. So these genes encode proteins in an individual which take any foreign antigen, so any part of a foreign body that is introduced into the patient, and will present it to the immune system. It will take a protein from any invading cells and say, guys, look at this. This is not great, essentially. That's its job. Its function is to protect you and to pitch to your immune system that something needs to be looked into. This is so important, as you can imagine, in a stem cell transplant. You're looking at whether an individual matches, because if we did a transplant with a mismatch, that could potentially lead to a rejection. Each individual has 2 copies of this gene, known as 2 alleles. One is inherited from your mother and one is inherited from your father. And as these are inherited genes, within a certain ethnic group or geographical group, they will form linkages and groups that are more likely to be inherited. So as a result, an individual who is white British and has a long family history in Britain as a white individual is more likely to have a certain HLA type than another. As such, it's super important to produce, to continue to produce diversity for our register. But these form something called a haplotype, which is sort of an identifier that is more common among a certain group. So when you're looking for a match for somebody, you're more likely to find one among a certain group. And as I mentioned, if you were to do a transplant that is a possible mismatch to any degree, there is more likelihood of rejection of that, because the immune system rejects the antigens that are presented because they are different. Or you get something called graft versus host disease, whereby the graft itself, the transplant itself, attacks the host, both of which can cause massive complications for the individual at transplant. And that's exactly what we try to avoid by providing the best match that we can. Next slide, please. There are other factors that come into a transplant. So you're looking at things like age and gender. Generally, young males are preferred for donations. Blood group is also a factor, but one of the ones that I want to talk about today is CMV, or cytomegalovirus. This has become increasingly important in the previous decades for a transplant, stem cell transplants in particular. This virus is overall pretty mild. It has a seroprevalence in the world of about 83%. If you looked at different demographics and different groups, ages, ethnicities, it varies. A general trend is that an individual who is older is more likely to have it, for example. And that's because once you catch it, you get rather mild symptoms similar to a cold if you are not immunosuppressed or immunocompromised, that is. And then it falls into a latency period. So it can reactivate if you come across it again or you come across a different strain. But generally, individuals who are CMV positive would never have known if they had not been tested by Anthony Nolan, for example. For an immunosuppressed or an immunocompromised individual, as we're dealing with our patients, they can have rather severe symptoms to this because essentially they have no immune system to keep fighting against the CMV. The CMV could go through something whereby it's reactivated or it's activated if they're catching it for the first time. So CMV is important in matching individuals for transplant. If you have negative and negative, you're pretty good. If you have pos and pos, you're good. There is a risk that an individual could have a different strain of CMV, and that could cause some reaction. But the main focus is if you have a negative donor and a positive patient. Essentially, when you do the transplant, you're knocking the person's immune system out. So when they have the transplant, they're essentially encountering their own CMV again, and that activates the immune system, and that can lead to these severe issues that can lead to rejection of the transplant or worse effects, including death. Positive donor and negative patient can just result in a standard infection, but as I mentioned, severe symptoms versus someone who is not immunocompromised or immunosuppressed. So it's becoming increasingly important for us to have that information and to be considered for transplantation. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the kind of background information. So we're going to jump into the FTDs a bit more. So FTDs or swabs or first-time donors or the register, there's lots of words that are used for this. In the labs and at Anthony Nolan, we refer to them as FTDs to separate them out from our clinical work. So these are our first-time donors, individuals who are donating to us for the first time and sitting on the register, doing an excellent job waiting to be picked. They will sign up, go through all the testing that I'm going to talk through today, and wait there until a clinician has a patient with a certain HLA type where they've been tested and they are looking for a match. And then we would be contacting them for further sample. FTDs are called first-time donors because they are individuals who are donating to wait on the register, but will eventually donate again some blood samples, to be tested once more. We don't just go off the initial type that we get from the FTD swabs. And similarly, quite confusingly, but we should represent them, we do have unbelievable individuals who donate multiple times to different patients or even the same patient, and incredible people, incredible jobs that they're doing, and don't necessarily fall into the category of first-time donors. That can be a little bit confusing, but I do want to just check that they're represented here as well, because it's just as important. Next slide, please. And for the swabbing, so I want to talk a bit about swabbing upgrade. When I started at Anthony Nolan 7 years ago, I was in a team who collected saliva samples from these individuals, and we would receive those in, extract them, and test them. Since then, we've upgraded to swabs. So these are done on a buccal swab. Essentially, that just swabs the inside of your mouth and collects some buccal cells or cheek cells from which we can extract the DNA. This was introduced because it is easier for our donors. It gives the similar or better DNA quality or concentration. And generally, it's just a little bit less gross. So, that's a bit of a selfish reason to do it, but in a lab filled with saliva is definitely not preferred to some nice packaged swabs. And to talk about further improvements that we're going to be bringing in, we're always looking to improve this process for our donors and our patients. So one thing that's recently happened is increasing the number of swabs from the 2 that was used previously to 3 or 4. You may, if you run an event or you're part of an event or you sign up, see 3 or 4 swabs in your pack. This is because we have introduced CMV testing for all FTDs for the first time, and those extra swabs allow us to do that. Furthermore, some of our donors will also be getting blood grouping through this for the time being. That's just kept to some of them. We'll be looking at that in the future. So constant improvement because of the important work we're doing is essentially my main point there. But what we're doing is getting all that information for the transplant centers so that, yes, they will get a blood sample down the line for these individuals and test them again. But if I'm a clinician looking and I know how important CMV matching is to me, Anthony Nolan is able to present that information straight up. It makes our donors more attractive, but also just speeds the process along. So it's important work. So that's one thing that we brought in recently. Okay, next slide, please. So I thought I'd start talking about online samples. So our recruitment system is split between online and event FTD samples. Online is where an individual from the comfort of their own home can sign up on their phone, on their laptop, by accessing the Anthony Nolan website, and they will request a swab pack, essentially. This is pretty simple. An individual provides some basic medical questions and some essential identifiable info, such as address. And from that information, we can ascertain whether that person would be capable of donation based on some criteria, not all of the criteria. They haven't been typed, etc. yet. And if that information is checked and they can potentially be a donor, they go through a system whereby a donor record is created. So in the laboratories and Anthony Nolan, we are always tracking information. It's so important that we keep information safe and we're able to identify an individual. So I am on the register, for example, and I know that I have a donor record in there. I can't remember my number, which is a bit sad, but I have a 6-digit number as a donor and then multiple samples attached to that. So when I signed up, they created a donor record for me and then created a bespoke ID for that sample. So rather than juggling thousands and thousands of samples and thousands of people, we have Kyle, me, here is my donor ID, and here is the sample ID for the sample that I did in 2012 or whatever. So that's generated, attached to the swab pack and sent out to the individual for them to do at their own home, at their own leisure, and then is sent back to us for the testing that I'll come on to in a little bit. It's important to note that all information is very carefully controlled, anonymized as much as is required, so that the donor is comfortable knowing we are looking after them, we're looking after their swab, and we're looking after their information. That's really important to us. That's why I wanted to specifically talk about donor IDs, etc. Next slide, please. Sorry. So just wanted to mention appeals a little as well. So in terms of online, this is where we see a lot of fluctuation. Events obviously fluctuate as well. But online can fluctuate in that it really depends on how many people are accessing Anthony Nolan and are interested in signing up. So from advertising or social media, all of which Anthony Nolan has teams that put information out there and get our name out there for, which is incredible. We also work through kind of hosting an event or an appeal online or in person to really get our name out there, get people invested. One that we've done recently is the Match for a Match, working with a local football team to have support for Anthony Nolan on their uniform, and to just really push that on their social media and our social media. If it's funding, if it's getting people on the register, it's all great news for us. So my team in receiving these samples will see ebbs and flows, and it's kind of my job to plan for that. But when we have these appeals, we can see a peak, which is to a degree stressful for me, but also incredible news for our patients. So that's the most important thing. Next slide, please. I think here I'm talking about some appeals as well. So these are appeals for specific individuals. So if you go onto the Anthony Nolan website, we also, with the consent of the patients, will occasionally launch an appeal to say, this individual has this is their story. Do you want to learn more about them? And this does a couple of things. Number one, it really humanizes our work. It really grounds the work that we do and provides evidence and examples to people of what we do every single day. What are all these people who work at Anthony Nolan focused on? What is our drive? And it's these incredible people. One thing that it does do that I'd like to talk about as well is really push for diversity on our register. Individuals who are ethnic minorities are massively underrepresented on our register. And on top of that, if you are an individual of a mixed ethnic origin, then you're going to struggle even more. As I mentioned before, the HLA is inherited from your parents and as a sort of collective within a certain geographical or ethnic group. And as such, individuals of mixed ethnic origin have a harder job of finding a match, because we can have an individual whose parents are from different sides of the world, as is more common nowadays than say 100 years ago, and they're going to struggle to find a match more than say a white British person in London. And that is not okay. That's not what we want. We want to really represent these people, and we want to give them the best chance that they can. So grateful for these people to put their name out there and really support us. Next slide, please. So that's online samples. The other one is events. So this is the main focus for today, I believe, that we want to talk and volunteering and supporters. So our event samples are slightly different. So this is where we can, as Anthony Nolan, go out and lean on our incredible supporters, our incredible coordinators and volunteers to host an event at a university, a police station, the Royal Air Force, or anywhere really, a place of worship, for example. And here what we're doing is we're trying to get people to access Anthony Nolan, again, to fund, to just be interested, to post on social media, get our word out, or to join the register, all of which we support. We're able to use these to access anybody, but we can target these as well, which is also great, as I mentioned, to ethnic minorities or to individuals like young men who are the target group for transplants. Next slide, please. And it goes without saying, these of course could not happen without our incredible volunteers. So we have volunteers across the organization. This isn't just to talk about, Marrow Group and universities. We have volunteers who provide help at so many different points throughout both the FTD and the clinical journey. And it would be wrong of me to do any presentation about Anthony Nolan, frankly, let alone just FTDs, and not, give a shout out to every volunteer who does incredible work for us. So if you're on the call, which I'm sure some of you are, then, thank you from me. And yeah, you play an essential part in this. So thank you. Next slide, please. So in terms of process, I was asked to talk a little bit about processes for the swabs. Events and online samples are quite similar in some ways. The same swabbing method is used. This is a validated scientific method. So it's the same swabbing method on the wallets. The same information is taken from the individual, be it at an event or online. And ultimately, the same testing will be performed on someone. But there are some differences that are worth talking about. So one is that there's some slight changes in the sample ID process. As I mentioned earlier, if you sign up online, you have a donor record created and a sample ID created under that record. For events, it's sort of like they're distributed. So if anyone has been to an event or has seen a talk from someone at an event, you'll see that there are pre-printed labels with sample IDs on them. This essentially means that a sample ID is kind of held in stasis and assigned to an individual is the way that it's done. And that comes with its own challenges, which I'll talk about in a second. You, of course, at an event will have multiple potential donors, hopefully thousands and thousands, obviously. We'll have events where people get a couple of people signing up, 100 people signing up, all valid and all valuable, but again, comes with challenges and risks. And then further, the samples are then sent in bulk. So rather than them going through the raw mail to the laboratories, they're packed into red bags and sent to my team through couriers and through the internal network. So just some slight differences there, and I'm sure there are more, but there's some ones that I'd like to talk about today a little bit. Next slide, please. So based on the differences that I've just mentioned, I thought it'd be good to talk about some things that we need to consider at events that can cause some issues, and particularly come up from how an event is different to online. Online, it must be said, it carries its own risks, and we are prepared for those, and I'm happy to talk about some of those as well. In terms of events, the main focus is that there are multiple people around. So the number one thing that I like to focus on, especially as a scientist, is that the swabs are taken only by the donor. Especially with the fact that we've got multiple swabs now. If I were to get a swab pack in and do 2 of them, and I think it's a really good idea to support Anthony Nolan to get my mate doing the other 2 so that multiple people can sign up, put them in the same wallet. In my eyes, that sample is from one person, and Anthony Nolan thinks that sample is from one person. And when we type it, we're going to get multiple alleles for those genes, and the sample will be unusable. So real simple, it will show us that, and we will catch it, which is an excellent quality control, but we will have to recall it. So that is money spent and time where we would rather not have to do that. So that's really clear. It's something that we need to really push at events, certainly. The worst one, though, however, would be an incorrect HLA type. So whereby somebody is not informed or doesn't necessarily check the instructions, or for whatever reason, there is a mix of the swabs. Now, this isn't great because it means it's less likely for us to catch it. If I do 4 swabs and I put them in my friend's wallet and they put theirs in mine, we're going to type them and think I'm this type, and I will sit on the register. And then one day a clinician will come along and be like, oh, Kyle's a perfect match for my patient. Let's get a second sample in. And we're going to then detect that everything's wrong. We do have that check in place. That's why we always do verification typing down the line on blood, of course. But again, it's time and it's energy and it's money and it's a shame, ultimately. So a very strong reason for us to push for good swabbing practices. And of course, if we as scientists always are on the side of caution when we're looking at these events happening, sometimes I've had events where I've been asked to investigate something and I can't identify where the problem has come up. So as a result, I have to recall the whole event or put my information towards supporting recalling an event. That would obviously be terrible. Be it a small or a large event, it can have a real big impact. If you don't know where the problem is, we cannot risk it. So if anyone's ever running an event, that's just something to factor in for the swabbing methods. And a slightly smaller point, but still important, is the information. So making sure that a donor is contactable so that when we need that second sample, we can reach them. The next one is samples being taken according to the instructions. So as I mentioned, it is a validated scientific process for us to get the best quality sample. If someone deviates from that, doesn't do it for the right amount of time, or doesn't leave them as required, and I'll come on to some of those, it can lead to a worse quality sample or something that is unusable. So sticking to the instructions is super important for us. It can seem like something simple at the event, but it has big impact downstream. All swabs aren't taken, so where somebody may get 4 swabs at the moment, if they don't do all 4 of those swabs, those additional tests can't be performed, essentially. We can't promise that all the tests will be performed. And furthermore, if somebody only does 1 swab, for example, we couldn't even tell you if the HLA is definitely going to be tested, because the reason that there were 2 before is that there was a swab for extra DNA in case the first one is contaminated or hasn't got good quality. So it's essential that we get all swabs tested. Next slide, please. So the next one is disposal of the plastic sleeve. So there's a sleeve that comes with the swabs that they initially come in, and the person swabs and packs them into the wallet. Again, deviation from the validated process. If it's in the instructions, they need to be followed. Please follow those, or encourage people to follow them for sure. And a very big one is the correct ID label. So this is similar to somebody doing the sampling incorrectly, but just kind of in reverse. If you use the incorrect labels, because they're not being sent to the individual, but they're being managed at the event, if somebody were to put the incorrect label on, it's just as bad as if they had swapped the swabs over. Furthermore, at some events, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there are instances where there are two labels that are put onto the wallets, one on the front and one on the back. If they weren't to match, I would instruct my team to reject that because I can't tell you which person it is and it's too big a risk for me and they would be recalled. So something to think about there as well. And then finally, just some small points. The swab wallets have a seal on them. So one of the issues that we see sometimes is that they are not sealed by the donor, be that online or events. At events, they are not packaged into another envelope for post. So it can mean that we lose swabs, in which case, not all the testing can be completed, which is a real shame. Sometimes we do also see things whereby the swabs aren't packaged correctly or the actual wallet itself is a little bit damaged or doesn't have the glue thing on it. This happens, we need to be ready for it. And if anybody here is running an event or coordinates an event in the future, that really needs to be raised with the event organizer to discuss how to handle that. My team are the ones booking in thousands and thousands of these. And when everything's done well, and then there's like a rubber band on it, it's a slight annoyance, but we'll accept it. But we do recognize that sometimes if they don't seal, it needs to be sealed somehow. So we would rather, peel off thousands of rubber bands than lose thousands of samples. Okay, so that is some things that can happen at events that I just wanted to flag, and I'm happy to talk about some more if you guys have any questions at the end. But the end point of that is that online samples will be sent to the laboratory by the Royal Mail. So we'll receive a bag of those every morning, or 2 bags or 3. And the events will come via courier to Anthony Nolan. And that's handled, as I mentioned at the beginning, by my team, the technical services team. Next slide, please. Yeah. So our job is to book these samples in and get them shipped off ready for testing. However, as I've mentioned, there can be things that occur at events or online for sure, or just through the post. So you can see here there are 2 things that there's one thing that happens here in terms of a quality check, and it can result in 2 different outcomes. One is a damaged wallet. So my team are trained to identify damages in the wallet. So you can see a list on the left-hand side. This is taken from our internal database when they are scanning samples in. Some examples are given, such as a bent wallet, a crease in the wallet. These may seem rather small, but it can lead to a tear in the wallet and there being, a swab missing. And we just want to be able to track those things. I'm pretty thorough with data in that way. They'll be able to identify if something's damaged, and then down the line, if there's an issue, contamination, we're able to track these things and improve the process. The other one is that the sample is completely unusable. So my team, it is sometimes a little bit nuanced, and they'll escalate those things, but there is a difference between something being damaged and the swab just not being usable. And here is where we get a severely damaged wallet. The sample ID is illegible, so therefore we can't identify the person. And no sample in the wallet is something, if we can pick that up, then there's no point in spending the money shipping it out. So these are reasons why we would then reject that sample, dispose of it appropriately, and get a recall for that sample and send a request to the donor for another sample. And once the quality check has been done, assuming everything is good, well, everything will be good, we'd be booking them in. So the barcode, as you can see on the right-hand side picture there's a lovely message that we got during COVID from one of our donors. Sometimes they put little messages on that keep us going. They all have a barcode on them which identifies the individual. So my team will use a barcode scanner to scan that into our system, which has all the information, whether someone's applied online or at an event, it is all digitized and ready for us to access. So they will scan that into that barcode box that you can see at the top. And the system will tell them what sample it is, whose it is, and where it's supposed to go, what tests it needs. So the bottom section there that says box details, what we're doing in the laboratory is scanning in thousands of these samples and packing them into a physical box, which is shown digitally here. So they'll have an identifier on as well so that we can track a sample all the way through. My team will scan that in and physically pack it and then move on to the next sample. Each of these boxes also has controls in. So we have people in the laboratory who are controls. Not that we have any doubt of our laboratories who are performing the testing, but it is so important for us to have internal independent controls on. So I routinely swab, for example. I've probably been typed about 1 million times as a control. They know my type. They don't know these donors' type. So it's important that they have someone in there too, that they can say, yep, Kyle's is correct. So there's a small check. The team will seal that box up once it's full to about 500 samples, and they will raise a request for a dispatch. So we have these nice cardboard boxes with 500 samples in, and my control package that up nicely and raise a PO for it to be dispatched out. And yeah, so this is the next stage of it. So once we have raised that PO, we will organize for a courier to come and collect this. And Anthony Nolan, I believe as of 2017, perhaps before, I can't remember when I was on the committee that changed the swabs, do not currently perform FTD testing routinely in-house. It is all external for financial reasons. It allows us to focus on the clinical work and also maximizing the register for all. So we ship out all of our FTDs to 2 laboratories currently, one in New York in the USA for that's histogenetics, and one in Europe, which is actually DKMS. They provide some of our testing. So my team will pack that up and ship it off, and it will arrive over there, and their teams will extract DNA from these swabs and let us know if there's any issues. Again, all data tracked, all checked, sample IDs. We provide files to them of what to expect, and that's all checked. Once they have extracted DNA from these samples, they can perform the testing. And this is done using next generation sequencing, which is a global standard. A lot of laboratories use NGS. It is talked about very widely as the current gold standard. And that is an improvement on previous sequencing methods that we've had in the past, where you wouldn't get as much of a higher resolution type. When Shirley Nolan started the register, you'd be able to identify a person as sort of an A2. That is a category that you can use, like A2, A24, B1, B21. Now you're looking at a massive string of numbers that allows for more specificity in the person's type. And I mentioned NGS, it's currently typing the HLA genes. So along your gene, you have sections of that gene called loci or A locus. And these are some of the loci that we currently type. So you've got the A locus, B locus, C locus, DRB1, etc. All of which are used to inform the clinicians about the possibility for a match. And then also they perform, as I mentioned, the CMV testing. This is done by a method called ELISA. And this is actually very sensitive. So when we prepare swabs, when we were validating those, we were finding that the DNA quality and yield does decrease over time, as one would expect from a biological sample. But it is relatively, sturdy. It holds out. The CMV, however, is one that we want tested very quickly because that one is a little bit more sensitive. So that's why it's, I'll touch on some of the mechanisms which we have in place to be able to manage our KPIs and our TATs, but it's super important that we get them to the laboratories and get them booked in, shipped off as soon as we can. And then just to finally point out that one of the KPIs we have is that with these external laboratories, we have high expectations of them. They're providing us a service. So we expect results within 40 days. We expect controls to be on their runs, to be able to provide us with quality control information whenever we like, essentially. So just keeping them to a very high standard as we would our own samples were we to do them in-house. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so once we get some results back from these laboratories, they come back in streams and streams of data. So what we do here is we're authorizing our test results using our internal systems. So the information and tech team will receive all of this data, check that we have everything we need, check everything is accurate and appropriate and corroborates with the information that we were expecting. And we'll then pass this on to the clinical services team, Anthony Nolan, who I'm very fortunate to work closely with in the laboratories. What the clinical services team are doing here, as a team of clinical scientists, they're looking over the results and they're checking to see if there's anything on each result from this individual. Is there anything that stands out? Do they need any further testing? Are there any new alleles that we're noticing? Any new types of genes that we're noticing? Anything interesting at all? Does anything not fit what we want, basically? Much smarter than I am. And they get these results, and there's some results at the very bottom here. So you can see the sample ID on the left hand side. Normally right now they're beginning with 109s. We're on the precipice of 11s numbers. You can see along the top in the dark gray, the A, B, C, DR, DRB3, 4, 5, etc. Loci that are being typed. So here you can see results for these individuals, and where I spoke earlier about having 2 alleles, one from your mother, one from your father, the top line would be one of those and the bottom would be another for each sample ID. And you can also see that these are given as a code. So you'll see something along the lines of 01 :BMJZM or something along those lines. Essentially, the NGS typing is of such a good standard right now that the number of digits you would get for a string is so large that what we want to do is kind of compartmentalize that so that it's readable, and that's routine within the HLA community to be able to access this information. So here you can see people with very different types just of these three for some similarities between the loci, but ultimately they have these different alleles which are indicated by the string of digits. So the team are checking that everything's good to go and that all the results are good. Anything that isn't, they would be querying and sending information to the respective teams. But their job here is to upload the results to the database, which makes the individual active and searchable. So once loaded, a TC, a transplant center, is able to say, hey, we have this patient with this HLA, can we access your database and search for it? And we allow them and they find someone, hopefully from, possibly in this batch. And that's kind of the end point of that result stage. If everything is good, then they just get uploaded and searchable. And I've touched on a couple of bits here in terms of how the teams work together. I've touched on parts where there are issues and how everything, we're hoping, generally would go smoothly. And I've touched on the number of people who contribute to the FTD journey. I wanted to talk a little bit about FTD operations. So you can imagine this process, which is currently, between countries, organizations, teams, individuals, groups, people, absolutely, is one that is very diverse and has to be monitored, and we need to keep it in good check for the incredible work that it does. So what we have is a group called the FTD Ops Group, FTD Operations. And they include myself, representatives of different divisions. So we'll have people here from the lab teams, like me, and then we'll have office-based staff, such as donor provision, donor support, IT and data are there. All of them are there to look at a situation, look at the flow of FTDs through the system and say, hey, this actually involves me. This is my take on it. So from my point of view, I would be saying the risk of this happening at an event could impact the samples this way. And then somebody in donor support may say, that's great, Kyle, I hear you. From my point of view, this is the donor experience. So when we do that, we need to handle it this way. So massive collaboration between the groups and an incredible example of Anthony Nolan working to focus, the betterment of the experience of our donors and the quality of our register. So there's some points here of the kind of work that we do each day as a collective, and this is part of our roles. We are assigned to join this FTD Ops group, so we need to fit it in with our routine work. But I really wanted to just stress that, my team can have 10 samples arrive in a day. They can have 100 samples or 1,000 samples. And like I said earlier, that's my job to monitor and make sure that they're supported. But the FTD Ops group is working on a basis of, yes, those thousands and thousands of samples with a register currently over 800,000. That's all going great. But we also have meetings where we're talking about 1, 2, 3, and 4 samples, making sure these 4 people can get onto the register. And we really try and push that because it's very simple to get lost in all the sample IDs and all the numbers. And then we're there trying to get one person's information to get them on the register, figure out what's happened. And the reason we do that is because of what I spoke about earlier, how important this work is. It's important that we prioritize every donor so that we can maximize the number of people who go on the register, because ultimately it just takes one person to be able to donate to someone who is struggling with blood cancer. And they would be a life-saving match for someone. So we have to do our best to make sure that they can get on the register. So it's some days you're looking at thousands, some days you're just looking at 1. So it's quite a range, but it's incredible work, speaking for the others in the collective. But yeah, just something to keep us cooking along really and making sure everything's monitored. And yeah, so FTDs, like I mentioned, all of these people who are mentioned here in green, and certainly more people do this all for our patients and for the experience of our donors. I've spoken a lot about the FTD journey and how diverse it can be, and there's a lot more to talk about probably, but I've tried to touch on the really important bits here. I'd just like to close the presentation just reminding everyone listening and also myself that that every donor for us is an immense achievement. It's really important that everybody here who is involved with Anthony Nolan is proud of the work they're doing, because the clinical work, the work in labs, the labs in the offices, Nottingham Cord, events online, it's all contributing to helping save the lives of people who are suffering with blood cancer and people who have blood disorders. So every individual is important in this journey. And thank you, and just a recognition of all the work that everyone on this call does, essentially. I think that's everything I've got to say about FTDs right now. So thank you for hearing me out. I think we've got some time. I think I've run over a little bit, but we've got time to ask some questions. And there is my silly little face and my email address. If you would like to pop me any afterwards, you're welcome to as well.
Thank you, Kyle. That's really interesting. I've learned some stuff as well with that. Has anybody got any questions? Stunned everybody into silence.
What is the current success rate of donations for patients, for both adults and children? I know they do differ. I was told originally that it was a 50% good chance of it working for an adult and about 75% a good chance of it working for a child. Is that still the same, or are things improving?
Yes, good question. So that's the data that that's exactly the data that I've got most recently. It's something that I can definitely take and check in and get back to you if you'd like, but that is what I've been told. And that is factoring in every transplant and every donation, whether it's from an adult, a young adult, cord. If you were to look at some of those specifics, then they'd probably, move around a little bit. Cord is generally considered to be incredibly good for transplants, and will be something that we look at more in the future for sure. But so 50% to 75 is exactly what I've got. Yeah.
May I ask another question? You mentioned the various reasons why things can go wrong when samples come into you, both from recruitment events and online. What percentage of samples do you have to reject as a result of problems like this?
So that's a good question as well, because I did stress issues quite heavily, and it's good to contextualize that. I'm constantly looking at a less than 5%, more like 3, 2, and 1% rejection. Most events are pretty solid, and we actually don't reject them because the quality of them has improved so much. Moving to swabs certainly helped with that. Onlines generally are pretty good as well, because they are in 2 wallets, so they get a lot more protection through the post. But sometimes we do receive something with a questionable footprint on it, or it's bent in half or something. So yeah, less than 5% is the routine. So it's a really good stat.
Thank you.
Hi, Carol. Can I just ask a quick question? First of all, I must apologise because I was flitting between doing my job and listening, so I may have misheard something. But when you were saying about the samples, one of the labs in America, is that because we don't have the technology or the facilities here, or I'm guessing that's the reason? But I was just a bit surprised about that.
No, it's a really good question, and I will be 100% honest about it. When we moved from saliva to swabs, when we were doing saliva, it was my team's responsibility to extract every single FTD that we get in, and they were all tested internally. We used to have a process called TGS in the laboratories, and we moved on to NGS a couple of years ago. When we moved to swabs, we had a validated extraction technique, and we have the validated typing process, so it was completely possible for us to do the testing. What it comes down to, from my understanding, is literally from a money point of view, where is it best to put our funds? And that is so that we can maximize the number of people on the register. The numbers that we're seeing nowadays, a few years ago, the year before COVID, my team saw the highest number of swabs that they ever got in. So we celebrated that quite a bit. Obviously, it could be feasible. We could maximize what we've got. That could be something that is looked at in the future. Who knows? But at the time, the call was made based on what's the best use of our funds as a charity, especially.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Yeah. But there are facilities that you could outsource it to in the UK. It's such a specialist piece of kit that it needs to go to the States. Is that right?
So the reason we use histogenetics, there are definitely places in the UK, and we have good contact with other laboratories who we have as backups, just in case anything such as a global pandemic could happen. So the states that the histogenetics one is used with their experience, their high throughput, and the relationship that we already have with them was really good. So yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, it wasn't anyway. It was just pure curiosity I was asking about it.
No, again, I'll be honest, it was a good question, because when we moved away from doing the typing of our FTDs, people who had been working for that in the labs for that felt very, it was a very personal thing that we had the clinical work on one side and we were keeping the register moving on the other. So to take that typing out was something that took a lot of communication with these people to get them to understand.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
Has anybody got any more questions? No.
Hello. This is maybe slightly unrelated to the talk, but I have a colleague who's been called up as a potential match. And so she went to donate her second set of blood samples and then was told that it would be like an 8-week wait between being recontacted. I was just wondering why it takes so long for that.
Yeah. That's a good question. So in terms of getting to the secondary test, or even, a third blood sample stage, the reason for the wait is that the decision is not made by Anthony Nolan. We support a decision but from a transplant center. So where a TC will request from us and possibly even other registers for an individual, they will then take time to assess that and assess who is the best match, which individual is the best match for that. They may also look at cord blood as an option as well. So it can come down to the TC in question, the urgency of the transplant, things like that, as to why something takes a little bit longer in making the best decision that they can. And yeah, in that time, that's coming from the TC with support from Anthony Nolan. So again, as I said in my slide earlier, it's relying on the selflessness and patience of people with this, but we do recognize that it can be a bit of a wait, especially if you're excited about it. I was called up to be a potential match about 2 years ago, and I was picked over someone else, and I was publicly, but probably should have been more privately, gutted. But yeah, hoping I can do that one day, but I completely understand that can be a bit of a tricky thing, but it is for the best reasons.
Yeah, any more questions? No. Okay, then I'd just like to thank you again, Carl, for giving your time this morning to talk to our volunteers. The session's been recorded, so the recording and the presentation will be sent out shortly. But yeah, thank you for your time. Lovely to see everybody, and look out for the next one.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thank you. Thanks very much, Kyle.
No worries, anytime. Thank you all.